at OU. And I, with my colleagues Anne-Marie Eckert and Jane Wickersham and Allison Palmer, who are all here, run this organization or this series together. So very happy to welcome everybody to the opening session of this academic year. And I'm going to introduce Professor, I'll get this right, Quasmore, whichever it is. Oh, there you are. What is it? Quasmore. Okay. And Professor Quasmore is an associate professor in the English department at University of Central Oklahoma. She earned her doctorate from the University of Arkansas in 2016, and she served as a Fulbright teaching fellow before coming to this university in 2018. Dr. Quasmore's research focuses on early modern gender, poetry, and social historiographies. Her first book is called Gender and Position Taking in Henrician Verse, Tradition, Translation, and Transcription. That was published just about a month ago by Amsterdam University Press. The book explores the often ignored impact of female authors and readers during the reign of King Henry VIII. In particular, today, Dr. Quasmore is going to focus on a young niece of Henry's, whose poetry expresses a fascinating relationship to the crown, to the king, and to her culture's ideals of love and social conduct. We will get a glimpse into one very powerful woman's personal reaction to the events of 1536, and hear about some of the lesser-known casualties of Henry VIII's decline into tyranny. So I give you Professor Quasmore.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Coleman, and thank you all for that welcome. Let's see if I can make this a little less. And we'll move this over here for now. There we go. All right. First, a quick check. I asked earlier, but does anyone want an access copy where you can follow along as I'm speaking if you have any kind of sensory processing or anything that would make it easier to have a script? Okay. And Maria, I'm going to leave these with you. And then, first on those access copies, obviously after I printed them, I found a couple of typos because this is how these kinds of things work, right? Then I need to start with a quick content warning. There is a fair amount of talk about death coming up, and the poem that we will be looking at about 15 minutes in will involve specifically some discussion about death by suicide. The mentions of death by suicide do relate only to artistic or poetic representation. The other deaths, this being a discussion of Henry VIII's court, are real. To which point? There we go. On July 18th, 1536, a parliament called by Henry VIII passed a bill of attainder seizing all goods and estates belonging to Thomas Howard and condemning him to death for treason. So what treason had Thomas committed? Well, we might look at his age at the time, about 26, and guess that some issue of pride, his own or his accusers, was at play. Perhaps Thomas had pushed his own power forward too much and denigrated the now declining Henry VIII too often, as his nephew Henry Howard would a decade later. And we might, in this case, be onto something about the folly of youth and the paranoia of the king. But there is no evidence that Thomas ever plotted to supplant or murder Henry. So we might guess again then, hearing the name Howard and drawing the accurate association to the Boleyns, who were one branch of the powerful Howard family, headed by Thomas's elder half-brother, also Thomas, and the Duke of Norfolk. From there, we might conclude that this younger Thomas's fall had something to do with his famous niece, Anne Boleyn. Since Henry and his ministers had been willing to make the likely ludicrous charge that Anne had slept with her brother, why not include an uncle as well? And we'd be right to guess that the Boleyn trials were in play. but still not quite there, as Thomas was never accused of any inappropriate liaison with his niece. Instead, the same bill condemning Thomas Howard to death for treason itself establishes the illegality of his actions: marriage to a member of the king's family without the king's consent. So that is, the charge against Thomas is also the document that creates the law he is accused of breaking. At some point in 1535 and into 1536, Margaret Douglas, Henry VIII's beloved niece, and Thomas Howard, Anne Boleyn's powerful uncle, had moved from flirtation into serious courtship and into an understanding that met some of the criteria for marriage in the early modern period, which could include, as a recognized degree of union, the taking of oaths in front of witnesses. When Henry discovered the marriage or contract, a discovery which seems to have happened partly in the investigative processes around Anne Boleyn, he had Thomas accused of treason and sent both lovers to the Tower. After a few months, Margaret Douglas was moved to Syon Abbey. She was allowed to return to court in late October 1537, after more than a year of confinement, but relatively quickly for a courtier who had angered the increasingly volatile king. Her return suggests that Henry may have intended clemency. He eventually accepted, after all, the marriage of his sister Mary to his friend Charles Brandon, despite initially experiencing their similarly clandestine union as a great personal betrayal. However, whatever mercy Henry extended came too late for Thomas Howard. Thomas died in the Tower of illness just 2 days after his erstwhile bride was allowed to return to court. The awful consequences of this affair were partly about the people involved and partly just about timing. Thomas Howard's connections did him no favors at this time. The months following her very public, very pointed humiliation and execution were not a good time to be related to Anne Boleyn. But a couple of years earlier, that connection had provided all kinds of opportunities, not least the many courtly entertainments Thomas would have enjoyed alongside Anne's ladies-in-waiting, whose number Margaret Douglas had joined around 1534. Margaret herself was an immensely popular and powerful member of the court, and it is her part in the story that we will mostly take up from here. Margaret is the kind of historical figure who, once you get a sense of her place in the action, you inevitably wonder why you didn't know more about her before. And while I want to spend a lot of time today thinking about her poetry and its place in the court where she suffered and thrived, I also want to briefly point to some of her noteworthy historical contexts. Margaret's circumstances at birth and in childhood were enabled by a series of somewhat remarkable events. Her mother, Margaret Tudor, had been married to the Scottish James IV in 1503. 10 years later, her brother, Henry VIII's army, under the regency of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, defeated James IV's armies at Flodden. The Scottish king was killed in action. Now widowed, Margaret Tudor fairly quickly remarried, perhaps due to political pressure to remove her regency, wedding Archibald Douglas, an immensely powerful Scottish aristocrat, not quite 11 months after her first husband's demise. The marriage soon crumbled, and the marriage soon resulted in Margaret Douglas's birth. The exact order of those events is difficult to determine in retrospect. The result, though, was that Margaret Douglas entered a world where even the many difficulties that she encountered tended to reinforce her importance. She was born in England and spent her first years in the royal nurseries at Greenwich because of her mother's political situation. When the family was briefly reunited in Scotland, her father kidnapped his own 3-year-old daughter as a political bargaining chip with his wife and the Scottish and English courts. For the next 10 years, Margaret would move among various households as determined by her father's agendas. Her mother finally secured a divorce from Archibald in 1527, but Margaret would continue to be governed by him for about 3 more years. I do not imagine that any of this was exactly enjoyable, but it does seem to have given Margaret a sense of her own position nearly as strong as her notorious uncle's. That sense would have been emphasized when, at 15 or so, and as a result of the English royals' intervention with her father, Margaret joined the Princess Mary's household, this being Henry VIII's eldest daughter who would become Mary I. Of course, 1530 was not the ideal time to be joining that household, and so we are back to issues of timing. Mary's position was increasingly difficult from nearly exactly this period, as Anne Boleyn's status became a clearer threat to Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon's position, and so to Mary's as well. Mary and Margaret became lifelong friends, but Margaret still might have felt some relief when she was ultimately transferred to the household of the new queen, following Anne's coronation in 1533. And it was in that household, somewhere between 1534 and 1535, that she found her first love. I may reasonably be questioned on my willingness to call the affair between Thomas Howard and Margaret Douglas love. I just outlined that Margaret was of remarkably high status and well aware of it. Historians have broadly characterized the Howard family as an ambitious one. This would be the family that gave us not only Anne Boleyn, but also Catherine Howard. But I have 3 points here to anchor the term love to refer to this marriage. First, that the poetic expressions Margaret Douglas and Thomas Howard left behind focus on the love as their motivation, justification, and excuse. I'll mention these epistolary exchanges again briefly, but their key relevance to our work with Margaret today is that both of the lovers repeatedly appeal to the truth of their love as itself an inherent defense. Second, that love and comfort do not, in fact, have to be exclusive. That lovers can, and perhaps more often should, consider the mutual benefits of a partnership, making room for real romance as neither cynically self-serving nor naive about the work of a lifelong, all-encompassing collaboration. And third, that for courtiers of this high of status, love may be the piece that makes the power partnership work. Neither Margaret nor Thomas would have been unsophisticated enough to think that status had nothing to do with the marriage partnerships they might contract. But both were powerful and savvy enough to choose a partner who valued them for something more than that. And perhaps both also have the arrogance of their positions, the ability to assume they are wanted and that they deserve and will get a particular kind of idealized relationship. I promised in the title that as much as this talk was about a thwarted affair, it would also be, and thank you for indulging the alliteration, about petulant poetry about power. So ideally, I'd like to make space for both, for us to believe Margaret when she says this is love, and for us to think about what that means for a royal woman, for whom everything is always already about power, but whose marriage especially activates all kinds of power networks. A very key thing actually about Margaret's use of poetry is exactly its relationship to love and to power at Henry VIII's court. I've responded to some arguments that Stephen Greenblatt made famous in his Renaissance self-fashioning in my own recent book, a shameless plug, see the flyers over there if you didn't get one on your way in. In my work, I want to draw forward the points that we've made about love poetry as really about court service and think about what happens when we consider how much of that poetry was produced by women. To give the CliffsNotes version, Greenblatt, Arthur Marotti, and other critics in a field called New Historicism in the 90s do a really thorough job of showing that early modern love poetry is also about how these poets feel about their service to Henry VIII. That is very useful, but they also tended to make claims about this poetry as a specifically masculine enterprise. So not just how do people feel about service, but how do men feel about service and how might it be feminizing? So I'm looking at that work, but bringing in our updated understandings of how much women courtiers were involved in the creation of poetry and bringing in newer arguments about how power and gender axes mapped in the period. And then I'm seeing how we might reread everyone's poetry when we pull those together. As part of that, I'm also drawing on work that might be best distilled in Peter C. Herman's royal poetry, but which also definitely is informed by his collaborations with Ray Siemens, and Ray Siemens does a lot of open access work as well. They show how Henry VIII specifically used poetry to perform royal power when he was otherwise thwarted, largely, as they show, because of his youth. When Henry is a young king in the 1510s, he writes poetry that basically dramatizes the kind of power he'll later enact. And the way he uses that verse is about royal power, rather than about masculine power, insofar as the latter would be something that other men could share. And I've just brought in an image here of Henry VIII's writing desk. He thought of himself very much as a poet and composer, and I think that that is not necessarily an image we always associate with him now. So if we're taking these pieces of the framework together, Margaret Douglas is a court favorite. She's always been dynastically important, and she knows it. And she knows the consequences of this moment are partly about that dynastic importance. Some documents of the period indicate that she was being considered as a potential heir in the wake of Henry's disinheritance of his two actual daughters, and a sidebar here, the death of his illegitimate son. And that could be part of why Henry reacted the way that he did to her secret contract. If we consider those court practices around poetry, then we see some really clear reasons she would turn to this outlet. Not only is it a standard courtly practice to write love poetry, it's an understood way of complaining about or critiquing those more powerful than you, or those whose power is opposed to you. And her uncle has explicitly established that it is a method appropriate for royal use. To condense and reiterate before we move forward, Henry used poetry to express his frustrations at limits on his power. So, and therefore, his niece uses poetry to express frustrations at limits on her power. That is, on her agency and her ability to make decisions, yes, as other courtiers do, but potentially even thinking quite explicitly about whether she herself is a potential future monarch and how that might matter to what is happening to her and how she can or should respond. Because Margaret Douglas was such a prominent and powerful figure, she left a richer literary record than people outside this really niche field of mine might expect. And I am happy to answer questions or expand on my points generally about women's literacy, literary contributions and strategies, and power and agency later. But we're focusing here not just on Margaret, but on her life and work in the mid-1530s. From there, we are narrowing further to the work recorded in this text, the Devonshire manuscript. And after I sketch out some notes on her work throughout the text, we'll actually focus on just one really specific, really beautifully petty poem. So, this manuscript. This is a verse miscellany dating mostly from the mid-1530s to early 1540s. The most influential contributors and compilers seem to have been Margaret Douglas, another courtier named Mary Shelton, who may or may not have been involved in a little scandal with either Henry or one of his courtiers. It is kind of a mess in terms of deciphering the primary documents. And we also aren't sure if Mary and Madge Shelton are one person or two people, which would matter to what's happening. But this is Mary Shelton, and then Mary Fitzroy. She is also a very fascinating figure. She was very briefly the wife to Henry's acknowledged out-of-wedlock son, Henry Fitzroy, before he died, as I mentioned, which was also in 1536. And she's the sister of the more well-known Henrician poet, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, that nephew of Thomas, who is going to get himself in quite a lot of trouble in the 1540s, and who will, in fact, be the last person executed on Henry's orders. The manuscript offers us a really beautiful chance to explore courtly verse production in its original context, and not least shows us how much more social than individual the writing of such poetry was, and the extensive involvement of courtly women in verse production. As I said, these women seem to drive a lot of the text, and in that text, we see writers talking to each other, putting poems in conversation with each other, transcribing slightly different versions of the same poem, commenting on each other's works. It is just a really richly social text. In Margaret's specific case, there are 4 key ways she contributes to the manuscript. First, the manuscript includes an extensive stretch of epistolary verse between Margaret and Thomas. That is, poetry that they write as letters to one another. And this section is cool to me and poignant because you can see them riff off of each other's themes and even off of each other's preferred poetic forms. Margaret likes to use these repeated refrains in her poetry, and Howard echoes them back to her in a couple of poems. Second, Margaret writes these little back and forth verse exchanges with Mary Shelton. So that's Margaret on top and then Mary in both of the passages below. They often here seem to be sorting out how to behave at court. So one of them will make an argument for here counterfeiting a merry mode, and the other will say, I'm too sad to pretend to be happy. Third, Margaret and Mary Shelton annotate and comment on a lot of the verse in the manuscript. Mary and Margaret are sometimes talking to each other here as well. So to the viewers left of the main body of the poem, they're having a little debate about whether this poem is worth anything or not. And again, it's Margaret on top, followed by Mary. And finally, Margaret contributes, let's call it at least 2 original compositions. I want to hit the quotation marks around original hard there, because a key thing about writing in the period is that they think about originality and authorship differently. This is another facet to how we want to revisit some of that work from the 90s. Privileging or imposing single authorship tends to distort and masculinize literary history. But let's say that we are calling Margaret the original author in order to give her some of the recognition that authorship offers in the modern mind. We're adapting her history to how we think, and that we're calling the poems original to think about why her voice matters to the court audience. The poem I want to dig into with our remaining time today definitely takes on specific characteristics in its reading if we are hearing Margaret's voice. Poems in the Devonshire don't have titles, so I'll refer to this by its first line, now that ye be assembled here. I want to show you first the facsimile, and do not worry, we are going to move to something more readable very shortly. But I really can't overstate how cool it is to actually interact with this manuscript in the real world at the British Library when you're thinking about its history. And this is one move towards trying to give you some sense of that experience. This is Margaret's handwriting. Those are her smudges, her efforts to correct and to clarify. And you can find this and images and transcriptions of the entire manuscript in the online social edition of the Devonshire, which I've included a link and a QR code for on the final slide that I'll leave up during the Q&A. But for now, let's move to a transcription and a modernization. Promised it would be easier to read. For those of you in person, I've put those both on a handout. If you didn't grab one when you came in, they're on the same table as those book flyers. Since they are on the smaller side up here, I am hoping that those of you on Zoom are able to see them on a little bit closer screen. This modernization is from Elizabeth Heal's edited edition of the Devonshire. I love her modernizations for the increased accessibility they offer around these texts. But I also want to make sure we acknowledge that modernization is a kind of translation. In that book of mine I mentioned, I look at some of the ways that the ambiguity and difficulty of the earlier spelling is itself part of the poetry. It is a thing these writers are doing on purpose, sometimes at least. That strategy is not hugely in play in this particular poem, I think, but we want to be careful to not overstabilize the work when we can avoid it. So with a little bit of a focus on this more original transcription to at least most of my viewers' rights, I want to walk us through this poem one stanza at a time, first just paraphrasing the dramatic situation, and then thinking about what Margaret might be doing with this poem in the context of her particular social moment. So we begin. Now that ye be assembled here, all ye my friends at my request, especially you, my father dear, that of my blood are nearest, this unto you is my request, that you will patiently hear, by this my last words expressed, my testament entire. The teacher in me really wants to make you all summarize what is happening here. But in the interest of time, and since you did come to hear a talk, we are opening here with a kind of early modern version of, I'm sure you're wondering why I gathered you all here today. Specifically, Margaret notes the presence of her father dear, who is her nearest relation of those gathered. And she says to them, I've brought you all here to hear my will, which in the dramatic situation of the poem is oral, right? She's saying this to them, but actually becomes a text simultaneously, which is just a little aside about how cool the way poetry works can be, particularly in the context of early modern legal practice around oral versus written contracts. All of this is fairly standard stuff so far. There is some relevant scholarship, especially from Wendy Wall, on the ways women used death to authorize their speaking and writing voices later in the century. So let me know during the Q&A if you want to hear more about that. But the only word here that really cues us to some specific situation is patiently. It doesn't necessarily point us in one direction yet. We don't right now have a sense of why Margaret might want or need to ask that those she's gathered show patience while hearing her will, but the phrasing might invite some question. And we might also note that the tone of that first stanza feels fairly supplicating. But if we make that note, we are about to revise it as we get to the second stanza. And think not to interrupt me. For such wise provided have I that though ye willed, it will not be. This tower is high, ye see, is strong and high, and the doors fast barred have I, that no wight my purpose ne let should, for to be queen of all Italy, not one day longer live I would. A lot more happens in this stanza. We started with just the idea that she wants her family and friends to hear her will, but suddenly the speaker is indicating that they might try to interrupt her, and that she is so determined to one course of action and so apprehensive of their reactions that she has trapped them all in a tower with her. We'll come back to that tower imagery when we think about how the whole poem comes together. For now, let's also particularly note those last two lines. On the more immediate level, they matter for the way that they bring this suicidal self-determination into the poem. Whether we imagine her sort of languishing away or taking some more dramatic course of action in this high tower, she's declaring her own will about death in a way that in the period would have been understood as suicidal. That is, as a self-destruction that takes the determination of fate away from God and fails to trust in his divine plan. And I do want to briefly emphasize there, I am summarizing the early modern view of death by suicide, which I hope is very much not our own understanding. On another level, though, before we move forward, I want us to note the way that Queen of all Italy here works to activate her relationship to the crown and some flavors of nascent English nationalism because of Margaret's status and because there is no unified Italy at this point. She can't be Queen of all Italy. Yes? And some potential reference to the way that her position interacts with her imagined or available marriages and courtships. So thinking about how Margaret has just drawn attention to her royal English status, let's look at this last stanza. Wherefore, sweet father, I you pray, bear this my death with patience, and torment not your hairs gray, but freely pardon mine offense, since it proceedeth of lovers' fervence and of my heart's constancy. Let me not from the sweet presence of him that I have caused to die. There are, I think, at least two immediately available ways of reading these concluding lines. And I'd argue those two readings are intentionally, simultaneously available, always layered on top of each other in a way that means we need to read both ways at once. One reading is very straightforward. We read the stanza on its own. We forget that more strident tone in the middle stanza, and we hear the speaker say sincerely, "This is what is happening, sweet father, but don't blame yourself and try not to blame me. Death is coming and it's what I want and it's no one's fault." But I am unconvinced. And I think that if you are Margaret's contemporary and you've experienced how she thinks about her own status, and you have read her other poetry, and you've been here for the whole affair with Thomas Howard, you are probably unconvinced too. Margaret's father figure at the English court is almost certainly Henry. Remember that she's an infant in the royal nurseries. She's been in his household again since she was about 14 or 15, and she's just been in position to be his potential heir. Now, add in that reference to the tower in the first stanza from a woman who has just been in the tower, and that reminder of her royal position in the second, which the reference to the tower may function as well. Bring in that note about blood from the first stanza too, for good measure, and let's think about royal blood and authority and power. When we activate all of those references, I think we get a much meaner, much angrier, much more sarcastic reading of the last stanza, particularly in light of the way we're promised a will that then becomes either a suicide note or an indictment, or both. And this is really the intersection I hope to activate for you, we need both to read either. Margaret's anger makes the most sense in the context of the necessity for her to perform contrition, to pretend she isn't angry and that Henry is right and she's sorry and actually she'll just go off and die about it. Simultaneously, that faux self-abnegation is all about her awareness of her own position. The sense of self that lets her be angry means she does also know that this entire situation is because of who she is and because of what she is to her uncle father. And so we hear the speaker instead saying something like, this is what has to happen because of what you did, because of who I am. Oh, don't blame yourself. Bear my death with patience. Forgive me for what you've done to me. But also always underneath it, and for what really also I have done to him who I have caused to die. The sarcastic and the genuine are both there, and I think both expressions of something pretty honest in this moment. In my title for this talk, I want to own that I labeled this poetry petulant. Given the very real stakes and emotions I've outlined, I should acknowledge that label could seem pretty callous. But I also am interested in how this poem does show us a Margaret Douglas, a young royal woman and potential heir to Henry VIII, who has learned a lot from her royal uncle, and who reaches for certain flavors of entitlement, like those reminders of her royal blood, when she is thwarted. As I said when I offered my justification for calling Margaret and Thomas's marriage a love match, I think the emotions here are very real, and I think that power inflects how Margaret feels and what outlets she seeks for those feelings. The strategies for which she reaches are determined by courtly understandings of poetry as a way powerful people can express resentment when their power is thwarted. And that tradition tends to activate this space where genuine self-condemnation and a more ironic brand of self-righteousness are almost inevitably coexistent. Margaret's choice drawing on that tradition to mix her more resentful feelings with a somewhat performatively penitential speech in the possible readings of that final stanza seem to have been successful, both insofar as I argue, we can read the other option almost 500 years later, and more definitely insofar as it enabled her triumphant reintegration at court. Welcomed back into service to Henry's remaining three queens, Catherine Howard, Anne of Cleves, and Catherine Parr, Margaret survived, thrived, and suffered a great deal after this small window of her life. In 1544, she finally remarried, by all reports extraordinarily happily, though she was widowed tragically again in 1571. At court, her status was similarly variable. Determinedly Roman Catholic, we might expect her to have fared rather better at Mary I's court than at that of either Edward or Elizabeth. While she did thrive at Mary's court, though, Margaret seemed to manage a peculiar relationship of mutual respect and suspicion with Elizabeth I, despite Margaret's choice to marry her son, Lord Darnley, to Elizabeth's rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. Another complicated relationship of respect and suspicion, certainly. If you're following very closely and you know your British history, you can see the other tragedy coming. Lord Darnley was the husband of the Scots Queen who was almost certainly murdered and whose body the murderers may have then tried to blow up. Nonetheless, we could read the marriage as leading to one final triumph for Margaret. Although she died in 1578 at the age of 62, her grandson, already at the time James VI of Scotland, became, of course, James I of England in 1603. I'm not sure it would have been enough for Margaret. The evidence is that she never accepted that Elizabeth had a better claim to the throne than she did herself. We have fewer of these kinds of emotive works from the elder Margaret, though. Again, like her royal uncle, she seems to have moved away from poetry as an expression of resistance as she grew older. But in her earlier years, fortunately, she gave us this collection of poetry through which modern scholars are beginning to recontextualize court verse and women's literary achievements in the period. It's not a crown, but it's not nothing, though she may have given us more than we can give her. I hope here that I have given you a snapshot of how poetry worked at the Henrician court for women writers, for resentful courtiers, and for royals pushing against the restraints of their elders. And I hope this opens a door for you to explore more about Margaret, more about pre-modern women's literatures, and more about what gets left out of the histories we tell and the literatures we prioritize. Thank you. Yes, Alice.
The idea of love. 1800s, and it was an arranged marriage. Word, I think, is more, the action. All right, is there any research on that, on any kind of discussion of how, this idea of love in poetry is sort of backed up by different kind of notions about marriage and so forth at this time period?
So I'm not immediately thinking of any specific names to put in front of you for that exact intersection. But the sort of like additional bit here is when we're looking at whether sort of ideas of companionate marriage, let's call it that, were available to Henrician courtiers. It's not that everybody believes that's the ideal, but it does seem to have been available to some people in a couple of ways. One is the famous example, right, is Mary Tudor going against her brother to marry Charles Brandon. For those of you who aren't already like deep into this, Mary has agreed to a diplomatic marriage in France. Her rather old husband has died. Before she leaves, she gets Henry to agree that she can marry Charles Brandon when she gets back. Like, I do this for you, and then I get to do what I want to do. Henry sends Charles to pick her up, which was really foolish because he didn't want them to get married. He was already kind of plotting like where he could marry her off next, and Mary has met her brother and is like, actually, let's just get married here. So she's risking a lot, right? She is also giving up queen status to do this. She can be a queen someplace else. Margaret and Thomas, I think, offers, and I'm back to the literary record here. If I'm looking for their embodiment, it's her willingness to go to the Tower over this, right? But in their poetry, one of the things that's really striking to me is she addresses, hey, you all are going to say that he married me for the position and the money. And I don't care, because wouldn't you also say that as his wife, I should give him that position and money? Anything I have should be his. And then just thinking about her kind of specifically here, when her second husband is killed, Elizabeth is the one to break it to her, because everybody knows how hard she's going to take it. And so that idea, like where there's these documentations about like what is a happy marriage, I did finally think of one specific thing you might be able to chase down, which is work on Jane Lumley, married incredibly young. But her father was really, really concerned with marrying her to someone who would respect her education and intellectual attainments. And the two of them work as like a literary collaborative space where really she's the lead. She's the star there. Does that speak to that? And yeah.
Do this with their daughters, because there's some examples like that in Italy too, where they really educate their daughters. And a lot of times they don't have a son, so it's sort of like plan B, sort of. You have a daughter, so you educate her, but genuine kind of caring about your daughters and their life and their happiness.
Yeah, and I think the echo's back. Okay, we fixed it. Lumley to me is a particularly interesting example of that, because she's only 13 when he contracts that marriage, which is unusual. Not only is that actually young, even for the aristocracy, but it's unusual to see a father who cares marry his daughter, but he has them live with him. Like he moves them both. So it seems like he's trying to get the husband under his roof early enough that he can educate him to be a good husband to his daughter. I saw a couple of questions. You know what? I'll just pull them up. Let's look. And I will read them out. And I'm sorry, I was asked to repeat questions so everybody could hear them, and I will remember to do that henceforth. Who is the intended audience for the poem Margaret wrote in the Devonshire manuscript? Would she have expected Henry to read her verse, or was she expressing her feelings to those also writing within the manuscript who might have shown sympathy for her position and understood her mix of anger and supplication? This gets speculative immediately, right? But 3 threads I want to pull together. Margaret is definitely writing to her friends first, right? They are the ones passing it around. They are the ones commenting on it. But people know about this miscellany, and a lot of really powerful people are contributing to it. This also comes into a cool thing about the privilege poetry had at Henry VIII's court, and why it might be a space, Jennifer, to come to your question specifically about Henry, why it might be a space where she could let him read that and not think she was going to be killed for it. So I mentioned Henry Howard, that last victim of Henry VIII, I guess. Howard writes some suicidally critical poetry of Henry VIII. There are times where it's very, very clear who he's writing about. And he ends one of his poem, The Assyrian King in Peace with Foul Desire, which everybody knows is about Henry, ends with killed himself to show some manful deed. Like he's like, you are so worthless. But that poetry was never brought up in Howard's trials. And it's not that all art is like that. So he had commissioned some stained glass for his house that drew on the Howard's family's royal heraldry. And that is used as evidence in his trial that he's trying to supplant, that he's plotting to take over at minimum mentorship of Edward VI, but possibly even trying to position himself as a better candidate. But the poetry is completely left alone. Same thing with Anne Boleyn's trials. Moderns, you know, it's Anne Boleyn. Like we're all a little bit bedazzled or charmed or whatever, right? Like 500 years later. But as much as we want to look at it and be like, is Anne in here, and have those arguments about it, that's not clear, but it is clear that people involved in the trial were involved in this as well. And this is never referenced as evidence in any of the trials. So nobody ever says, oh, this love poem is evidence of the corrupt court that she was creating around her, right? Her sort of sexual incontinence. So I think it's possible that she maybe wants Henry to read it in this space where she has this kind of deniability, right? Oh, sweet father didn't mean you. Or, oh, that's just poetry. That's not real. In the same way that Henry himself had used poetry to say, I want to rule everything. But it's just poetry, advisors, so you don't need to worry about it. I'm going to do what you told me to do. And then the second question, a couple of questions. Oh, use of death in poetry. And do we know what Henry's response to Margaret's poem was? No. We do not know if he was aware of the poem. We do not know how he would have read the poem. How was this used throughout the Henrician court in women's rights? Oh, so the point of death. Okay. I am formulating this argument on the fly, so bear with me, okay? I'm tempted to say that the use of death or self-erasure as a form of its self-authorization is not yet gendered in the Henrician court in the way that it will be later in the period. And I say that partly because Thomas Howard, thank you, Jennifer, specifically has this bit, 2 bits actually. One where he refers to Margaret as mine none. And like, yes, it's mine own, but also the way it is spelled, it is mine none. So she becomes this marker of everything that he has lost. And then in another, he's transcribing from Troilus and Cressida, and he takes Cressida's name out. But he doesn't put Margaret's in. She just becomes this absence, right? And he is certainly very afraid he is going to die. A bunch of people who were his friends have just gone into the tower, and most of them did not come out again. And so this marker of like this love object is also an erasure, I think has to do with that death authorization, that self-erasure. Howard does it when he's talking about Wyatt. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, does it when he's talking about Wyatt. He'll talk about this sort of will to self-destruction. He references Pyramus and Thisbe when he's talking about mourning Thomas Wyatt. But then later in the period, what Windy Wall has some great work on, and who else am I wanting to get here? Philippi, Patricia Philippi, also has good work on mothers' legacies. Are these documents where women tell their children how to live because they think that they are going to die. And some of those are only published after the woman's death, and some of them are published with the justification of, oh, well, she wrote this because she was afraid of dying. But that expectation, this is an argument of my scholarship overall. We've moved out of the stuff I'm making up. The part that I have other arguments about is publication is in its baby years in England. It isn't gendered yet. Women are publishing. There's a lot of anonymous publication, but there are also women who put their name on their work. And with us importing our expectations when we go, oh, women wouldn't be allowed to speak. It's emerging. It's not that it doesn't exist at all, right? Like it has to come from somewhere. But it's not like publishing emerged in England and the first day they did it, they were like, only men, actually. Those expectations have to come from somewhere. Kendra.
Showing power and erasure in poetry, and then that in combination with presenting this as a will, I just find it like super interesting that it's like a presentation of her power in written form, but as like a spoken will, and then also implying that she's going to die soon. Would that have like special significance in that? Or because I know we were discussing like women's like belongings and power going to someone else when they die.
Yes, we were. Okay. I see what you're and particularly the oral element of that, right? Okay. So yes, and I immediately want to make another jump. So I'm thinking about her insistence on having it both ways, right? It's written and it's oral. And really only at court at this point are written documents given primacy over orality. I recommend Sebastian Sobecki for more work on orality in medieval law, right? But how it's carrying on into the 16th century. It's shifting again. That's why we call it early modern, right? Is all of these shifts have to start somewhere. But then Tertullian Evelenen and Helena, this is why I brought the book, because there's nothing more annoying than being like, if I had my book, I could give you this reference. But it's Tertullian Evelenen and Helena Romulan Brunberg. There we go. And I'll just give you the historical sociolinguistics. And part of what they look at is that this is still true, actually, linguistically. Women and people of quote unquote lower social classes tend to be drivers of linguistic shifts. Not in a inherent gender way, in a social gender way, right? So the lower classes still prefer orality. Douglas is sometimes using some of these linguistic shifts. She's moving into you in the subject position instead of ye sometimes, not in the example that I gave you, but sometimes. And so this idea, I think it's Nevalenen who says there may be covert prestige in vernacular forms. Does that, like that you're showing off that you're kind of one of the people and that you know the cool stuff, right? I think immediately of Gates's points, right, in The Signifying Monkey about the way that Black linguistics are used to signal coolness. Morrison says something similar in Playing in the Dark. So this idea of I can use this thing that isn't as correct to show that I'm hip and with it. I'm not guaranteeing that was true 500 years ago, but Nevalena makes the point about covert prestige and vernacular forms that might suggest it was. Hold on. Got a couple more in the chat. Okay. Yes, Kendra.
And I thought that was super interesting because, I don't know, that seems like it would be, do we have examples of a lot of men being in a book together?
Yes.
Interesting.
In here. Everybody's in here.
Everybody's in here.
Yes. I mean, not everybody. Again, we're going to argue about whether Anne Boleyn is in here for probably the rest of time.
Cross class too, because I have it hard to imagine that anyone's out here like writing little comments on Henry VIII's poetry, or would it be like more of all of the courtiers in a book? Or
Henry puts his poetry in a manuscript with other people's works. Ray Siemens has he's not up there, sorry. Ray Siemens has an edited collection of, it's the Henry, I think it's just called the Henry VIII manuscript, usually vernacularly, but it's his lyrics and his are marked out. It's like Henry did this. But they are mixed in there with other people's. Because Siemens does not make this claim. So I want to be clear, I'm not putting words in Ray's mouth. I would say that broadly, the assumption has been that the other compositions are by men, right? The assumptions have been that everything in Toddles, which is this miscellany that's an early print miscellany, and that's intentional, sorry. Miscellany is correct. For whatever reason, a century ago, we decided it was Toddles miscellany, and like, we're not changing. So Toddles miscellany is like the earliest sort of print collection of these, and it gendered a lot of poems in ways different than what they are in the manuscript form. So there are even poems where pronouns are changed, and so the speaker becomes masculinized. But then we just sort of, nobody was asking where the women were. And so I would say that we want to be more cautious when we talk about the Henry VIII manuscript. Certainly the Devonshire, we've already done the work, but to not assume that we don't know if it's an unattributed verse. We don't know who wrote it, and most of it was probably written more communally. It's more people chiming in with things.
only Henry VIII is being marked out. Like,
yes. Not quite only some people get a new, but his have a nice little banner, most of them at the top. It's like, hey, I did it. Allison.
I just have a question about that process. And so like in these courtier dinner parties, you might have music and someone speaking a poem, but would this be something like that where everyone's around a dinner table, or would it be like that you are loaning out this text, this written text that someone might write on and then give it back to you and then someone else would read it? Or would it, or how would that happen?
I am so delighted to be able to, I think, actually usefully answer this really specific thing that feels like we should have to have a time machine. But some of the editors on the social edition think that they found a couple of mentions of it in different locations so that it seems to be being passed around. And we do argue about this a lot, but Margaret and Mary will go through and next to some of them put "and this" in a way that a lot of us think is them marking out some things for performance, or for that somebody else wants to copy down, like that sort of like, you're right here, let me mark down the stuff that we're going to use. So both, we think.
Yeah, Joy. Yeah, I'd like to roll this back a little bit and just find out in what way were girls taught actually to write and to write poetry. Where did this come from? Because that probably wasn't just sort of built in.
So I think this, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give as nicely specific of a time machine answer for. But we can look at the education of a couple of specific women, and that can point us in some directions, right? So one shift in the scholarship that you might already be aware of, there's this instructional manual for how to educate women by Juan Luis Vives called Instruction of a Christian Woman. And for a long time, people thought that that was a progressive model. They were like, oh, Vives is putting all these rules on it, but he's saying they can be educated. And then we went back and looked at other educational treatises, and there's actually a few, like not a minority really, where it's basically saying, well, to this point, you're either educating your children in these arts or you aren't. Like, figure out which one you want to do. And so newer scholarship is actually treating Vives as more conservative. So he argues that women should have literacy, they should be trained to read like scripture and things like that, but they need to be sort of kept in the house, they need to be constrained, and you have to be careful not to make them too smart or they'll be miserable. Elizabeth Jocelyn actually says more or less the same thing in her Mother's Legacy. So Juan Luis Vives' Instruction of a Christian Woman, is Ashlyn still here? It would have been, Ashlyn, if you have the date for Instruction of a Christian Woman, pop it in there. It would have been the late 1510s or early 1520s though, because it's written to appeal to Catherine for Mary, right? Elizabeth Jocelyn is much later. I really should know because I literally wrote the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Early Modern Women's Writing about Jocelyn, but I don't right now, but it's around 1600, right? And she feels that she was overeducated and she thinks it's made her unhappy. And she says, hey, if it's a son, do these things. If it's a daughter, don't give her as much of an education as I had, because I think I got too much. That doesn't answer the how, right? But it does tell us that women were getting more, even sort of upper middle class. Elizabeth Jocelyn is. Oh, for Instruction of a Christian Woman. Okay. I was like, no, Jocelyn's later than that. Yeah. Okay. Instruction of a Christian Woman, 1523. Thank you, Ashlyn. It's my grad student. I think that's the opposite of how that's supposed to work as a relationship, but I'm gonna exploit it today. But it does show us that it was largely a choice that parents were making more than necessarily a cross-societal expectation. And we can also see that in someone like Jane Lumley. So she translates Euripides from the Greek at 13, which is really impressive. And her father really cared about her education, really put a lot into it, but she's part of a literary network. And so those women that she's writing to, right, we don't have as much information about at what age they knew this or what, but they're really well versed because they're going back and forth to each other with classical literary allusions. Men's parents could also decide that they didn't want their son to be educated in this tradition, that they wanted him to be educated in a different tradition. And so just kind of, it's not that I have an answer for here's exactly how it happened, but more that I'm interested in asking the question and opening it up and not necessarily assuming that it's unusual. Because we don't always know, people don't write that much about their kids, really. Like, less than you would expect. Not never. So this is where we get rid of like the modern idea that, oh, like they lost babies all the time, so it must have been fine. We have plenty of records of people being like, it's not fine. I'm really sad all the time. But that they don't necessarily tell us here's exactly how this happened. Even Mary or Elizabeth, we have to piece together who their tutors were. We actually even have to piece together who Henry's was. We know John Skelton was one of them, or at least John Skelton says he was one of them. But past that, it gets a lot dicier in terms of what was the actual pedagogical process. Though, if you want to hear about like early modern education broadly, Dos Cosas. Mulcaster is a primary text that you can go to. And I'm going to do the annoying self-promotion thing again. I do have a piece on women's education as portrayed by a I guess he's not a novelist because I guess novels don't exist, but a writer who writes long form fiction. Nicholas Breton writes a story called Miseries of Mavilia. That it has a complicated view of women's education, and she's again like a very middle class kind of character. See if I grab this. Thanks, Ashlyn. Since some of the poems were a little faulty, like Margaret's, how were they able to avoid getting in trouble for what they were writing in the draft venture? Great question. I think it is just Henry kind of had to privilege this poetic space because he had done it. He had written this really resistant poetry that was going exactly against what his advisors wanted him to do. And so since he had pretended that poetry, or not even pretended, he had made poetry a protected space where you could exercise critique in this way. If he takes that away, what happens to what he's already done? And how far back does he have to go, right? What are people allowed to say? What are they not allowed to say? Setting off this one artistic sphere, if anything, might enable some of his tyranny elsewhere. Okay, I do know we are at time, so let me just make sure that I've articulated what I've thrown up here for you. That's a link to the social edition of the Devonshire manuscript. I cannot express enough how much I love those editors. If you are writing a whole monograph about a thing that is at the British Library and you are in Arkansas and Oklahoma, this is about the nicest thing a set of human beings could have done for you. And that's a QR code that'll take you straight to it. I've put up my website, and then I've put up a blog post that is a little more scholarly. It's a similar level to what I did today, right? And it's open access. And then the final link is just to that book, which you also can get a flyer for on that table. The QR code is there. It's a little buried, but there is a link at that QR code to read just the introduction if you would like to do that. Also, let me say this. If you were just like, wow, I need more of this, and you're really committed to buying this very expensive academic book, AUP 20 gets you 20% off through the end of the month. AUP 20. All right, thank you all so much. Come see me if there's anything else. I'm gonna turn the